I think we've had some issues with the wireless setup, but it's good to see you. Good morning, church. How are you? I see a lot of new faces here. My name is Mark. I'm the lead pastor over at the East Bay Radiance site, and it's so good. I don't think I've been back since January, and so it's really good to worship with you, and I'm sure that God has a plan and a purpose for bringing each and every one of us here today. It's interesting. I'm a bit nervous before sharing this message, a message that I've shared, multiple times, and we're going to be talking about inner healing today, and it's an introduction, but it lines up with our focus and vision for the year. You guys remember what it is? I'm sure we've talked about it in depth. What is the vision focus for this year? Crafted, that's right, crafted. Crafted in love, crafted to love as well. And, as you think of this idea of being God's workmanship, His masterpiece, His work of art, many times it's hard for us to feel that, right? And also from that, walk into our purpose and calling. And the reason for that is we still have to struggle with brokenness and pain and wounds. And those are the things that often mitigate us from walking into this idea, right, this vision that we have for this year. And so this is, one of the reasons why we're going through this series out of the book of Joseph. And, central to the Christian faith is this belief that we have a God who entered into our world of sin and brokenness so that He might bring us wholeness and peace. And all too often, I think what happens is in church, we learn to hide or minimize the depth of our pain as well as our struggles. And we forget that one of the promises of Christianity is the healing of our lives, right? That by His wounds we are healed. And so there is forgiveness of sin. And that's critical and that's very, very important to the gospel. But it cannot end there. It also has to result in us being made whole. And the word for peace in the Jewish language is the word shalom, which it means actually literally to be made whole or to be of complete health. And this idea of wholeness is so important in Jewish culture and Judaism as a whole that over many years it became their way of greeting each other and also saying goodbye, right? And basically saying, I wish that you would be made whole. I wish the peace of God over you. And so this morning as we get ready for the message, can you turn to your neighbor and give them that greeting, shalom, right? Prophetically say that over them, shalom. Amen. It's weird, right? But I think there's something important in that word. And the story of Joseph is a realistic picture of how the healing of God unfolds in our lives so that we can experience this wholeness, this peace of God in our lives. And the thing is, it isn't instantaneous, right? Inner healing is not a magic bullet. It's not easy, and oftentimes it's not even pleasant. But as God peels away the layers and layers of pain in our lives, it's amazingly beautiful and so effective. And talk about my own personal journey later on, but let's turn to the story of Joseph, and I want to introduce some principles for emotional healing, what we call inner healing, as we dive back into the story of Joseph in Genesis chapter 41, verses 46 through 42. This is the word of the Lord. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. During the 7 plentiful years, the earth produced abundantly, and he gathered up all the food of these 7 years, which occurred in the land of Egypt, and put the food in the cities. He put it in every city, the food from the fields around it. And Joseph stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured. Before the years of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, bore them to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. The name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. And Genesis tells us that Joseph was 30 years old when he ascended to his position of ultimate power, second only to Pharaoh in all of the land of Egypt. And basically, we're condensing like 10 chapters of Genesis into 2 messages. And so what we skipped over was his time at Potiphar's house, where he became the chief manager, only to be thrown into jail because of false accusations lodged against him by Potiphar's wife who tried to seduce him. But even in jail, we see that Joseph again rises to prominence and becomes known for his ability to discern dreams as well as to manage the jail itself. And what we are reading here is that after 13 long years, right, he was sold into slavery at age 17. After 13 long years, Pharaoh has his famous dream where 7 healthy cows are devoured by 7 skinny, ugly cows, and then 7 full years of corn are destroyed by 7 withered stalks of corn. And Pharaoh is troubled, and he's asking for the right interpretation. And so Joseph, having the Spirit of God on him, correctly interprets the dream for Pharaoh, telling him that the dreams are one and exactly the same. There will be 7 years of plenty, followed then by 7 years of famine. And Pharaoh, realizing that this is the right interpretation, places Joseph in control of all of the resources of Egypt. He finally has come to the place where he has been destined by God, right? This is the purpose for which he was born, what he was created for. And like so many career-minded people, and that's exactly what Joseph is, right? He's not a priest, he's not a prophet, he's not a pastor. He's a really astute business person. And so like many career-minded people, he didn't start his family until very late in his life, late 30s. But before the years of famine, what we read is that he had 2 children. And what's interesting is that up to this point in the narrative, up to this point in the telling of his story, we're not given any insight into Joseph's inner turmoil. We can kind of guess, right? The pain, the anguish, the distress that he must have experienced, but we're not given a window into that until this moment. And we see it in the names of his children. And the first son's name is Manasseh, which literally means to forget. Horrible name for a child, right? Forget, right? But it's alluding to the fact that Joseph tried all of these years simply to forget his family, forget what he left behind, forget that pain. The second was named Ephraim, which means to succeed or to be fruitful. Much better name, right? And what we can clearly deduce from those 2 names is that Joseph did all that he could to forget the memory of his family, and he used his success to numb the pain. And, I think it's fairly safe to assume that this describes so many people in the church. Especially, I think, here in the Bay Area. And even though you might not be doing this consciously, many of us are trying to forget the pain of the past, maybe trauma from the past, by covering it with our ambition, our busyness, our success. That's something that naturally happens. And sometimes this is actually a part of God's gracious plan, allowing painful memories to lay dormant in our hearts until we're actually mature enough, ready enough to deal with them. But ultimately, God will cause us to revisit these areas of your life because there are 2 key principles of healing that we see in this passage. First, forgetting is not equal to the healing power of forgiveness. Amen? Right? You cannot forget. I think we all realize, as much as we try to forget, right, your heart, your soul, your spirit, your mind will not allow you to forget. You are still living out your pain, right, in one way or another. And so forgetting is not equal to forgiveness. 2, having success being functional at the highest level does not equate to being whole. And again, right, we make that mistake. You know what? I'm having so much success in my life. I'm making X amount of money. I've gone through, the best schools, and I've done well for myself. But that does not mean wholeness. And, one of the remarkable things about Joseph is that he is able to be perfectly functional, maybe even overly functional, for almost 20 years as he works as a slave, as he toils in jail, and eventually rises to prominence over all of the land of Egypt. But being functional, even at this very high level, is not the same thing as experiencing the deep peace and the deep shalom of God in our lives. And again, if forgetting was the same as forgiving, if being successful the same as having peace, I think the story of Joseph should end here, like so many other fairy tales. This is the happy ending, isn't it? Right? Right? I found a beautiful wife. I have 2 great children. I am now, found the success that I'm looking for, and it should end here. But God does not actually allow it to end there. And actually, the breadth of the story takes off here. And what we see is that we can only find true shalom by confronting our forgotten memories and addressing our pain directly. And so as the story of Joseph unfolds, that's exactly what we see happening. The 7 years of famine impact all of the surrounding areas, forces then his brothers to travel to Egypt to find food, where they come face to face with the very brother that they betrayed. And so let's pick up the narrative again. There's going to be a lot of passages that we're going to read. And so as we pick up the narrative again in chapter 42, this is what we read as God begins the process of healing Joseph's life. Now Joseph was governor over the land. He was the one who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brother came and bowed themselves before him with their faces to the ground. Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he treated them like strangers and spoke roughly to them. "Where do you come from?" he said. And they said, "From the land of Canaan, to buy food." And Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. And Joseph remembered the dream that he had dreamed of them, which was all, that they would bow down. And he said to them, "You are spies. You have come to see the nakedness of the land." A key point to note here is that this is actually the first time in this entire story that we see emotion being attached to Joseph. And it's understandably in the form of anger. His brothers don't recognize him, assume that he's an Egyptian, but Joseph recognizes them. And the natural and the immediate response of Joseph is one of deep, deep anger. And he accuses them of being spies. And so essentially what's happening is that all of these years that he has repressed these emotions, that he's tried to forget, it has not gone away. Repressed anger comes out in so many different forms in our lives, whether it be anxiety, insecurity, even depression. I've seen ambition being one of the ways that repressed anger comes out. There was a young man that I used to talk with here at the early part of church. He would talk about how during his teenage years, the kids around him, the students around him would make fun of him. And so as a way to get back at him, he decided, you know what, I am going to be as successful as I possibly can be. And he was driven by that. Now, one day he would show these other students that, he had become something. And I would tell him, you know what, they don't care. Right? They have probably forgotten you, and this is a battle that you're fighting on your own. But you could see that wounding drove his ambition. And so there's so many different ways that our pain and our past can drive us. And the question that we need to ask ourselves is that in a world where sin abounds, where people sin against us, where we sin against others, and where hurt is unavoidable, how can we get ourselves on this path of healing? Right? How can we be made whole? And the answers are actually found in the rest of the story of Joseph, because from this point on, what we'll see is Joseph weeping at several key moments. And we'll look at 3 of them this morning: tears of remembrance, tears of loss, tears of the gospel. Pastor Paul, I believe, will look at the last one, which is tears of reconciliation, and use that to tie us back into the book of Ephesians. And you might be wondering, why are tears so important in this story? And the main reason is simply the fact that Joseph has probably repressed all of these emotions for years, and now he is finally ready to face some of these feelings that he's had. And one of the other principles of inner healing is this. If you could go to the next slide. Inner healing releases us from a past hurt, disappointment, or traumatic event that is often accompanied by an emotional release. Right? Not always, but often it's followed by a great deal of tears. And so let's begin to look at some of these tears that Joseph begins to shed. Genesis 42, let's pick it up again. This is what Joseph says to his brothers, right? As he is confronting all of his memories. He says, if you are honest men, let one of your brothers remain confined where you are in custody, and let the rest go and carry grain for the famine of your households. And bring your youngest brother to me, so your words will be verified and you shall not die. And they did so. Then they said to one another, in truth, we are guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the distress of his soul when he begged us, and we did not listen. That is why this distress has come upon us. And Reuben answered them, did I not, I hate Reuben. Did I not tell you not to sin against the boy? But you did not listen. So now here comes a reckoning for his blood. Thanks, Reuben. Right? They did not know that Joseph understood them, for there was an interpreter between them. And then he turned away from them and wept. And he returned to them and spoke to them. And he took Simeon from them and bound him before their eyes. You can see the anger there, right? It must have felt so good to take Simeon and tie him up, right? Just as they tied him up, many, many years ago. And in this passage, Joseph now is beginning to devise his plan to be reunited with his youngest brother, Benjamin, who shares, if you remember, the same mother with him and had nothing to do with the betrayal. All the other brothers, if you go back into the story, they're actually half-siblings because they have a different mother. And so at this point of the story, what we see is Joseph really doesn't care to be reunited with the rest of the family besides his father and his youngest brother. But something unexpected happens because the brothers start talking to one another about how this mean Egyptian, right? They have no idea why this guy is so mean to them, is simply retribution for what they did to Joseph so many years ago. And in reality, as you read the story, you realize that no one has forgotten the events of that day. As much as people have tried to move on, no one has forgotten. Joseph has not forgotten. His brothers have not forgotten. And for Joseph, the memory of pleading with his brothers for his life, for them not to sell him into slavery, the distress of his soul at that very time, it comes searing back into his mind, and he's forced to relive that traumatic moment once again. And so no wonder he could not control his tears. The tears, right, that he has held in for all of these years, they come welling up. And you might ask, why would God want us to relive such painful experiences? Why drag up these memories that have been repressed for so long? And the best explanation that I've heard is by Chuck Kraft, who's a pioneer in the ministry of inner healing. And how he explains it, and it makes so much sense to me, is that it's like a bone that has set incorrectly, right? And sometimes that happens if you don't get the right medical attention. And so the bone, if it sets incorrectly, the only way actually to go in and fix that is to re-break that bone and then allow it to set correctly the second time. And, why would God, as he's, watching over our lives, why would he allow a partial healing in us? Well, I believe, especially with childhood trauma and childhood pain, we don't have the maturity, the emotional capacity to be able to think about our pain in a mature way. And so God allows, certain things to heal maybe incorrectly would be a hard word, but partially, right? There's a partial healing that happens, but eventually God has to go back in, break it again, so that it could heal properly. And I think that makes so much sense. And that's exactly what's happening here, right? There's a partial healing that's allowed Joseph to be functional, to live at a high capacity. But God is saying, now you have the maturity to be able to deal with this. And so let's bring healing to you and to your family. And this brings us to our second set of tears, which is the tears of loss. And picking up the narrative in Genesis 43, this is what we read. Joseph lifted up his eyes, and so his brothers have gone back, right, with the food. They've run out of food. And so they realize, oh, now we need to go back to Egypt. And if we go back without Benjamin, right, we will, we'll be seen as spies. And so they bring back Benjamin, and let's pick up the narrative there. He lifted up his eyes, meaning Joseph. he saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son, and said, "Is this your youngest brother of whom you spoke to me? God be gracious to you, my son." Then Joseph hurried out, for his compassion grew warm for his brother, and he sought a place to weep. And he entered his chamber and wept there. Then he washed his face and came out. And controlling himself, he said, "Serve the food." They served him by himself, and then by themselves, and the Egyptians who ate with him by themselves, because the Egyptians could not eat with the Hebrews, for that is an abomination to the Egyptians. And they sat before him, the firstborn according to his birthright, and the youngest according to his youth. And the men looked at one another in amazement. Portions were taken to them from Joseph's table, but Benjamin's portion was 5 times as much as any of theirs, and they drank and were merry with him. As Joseph is reunited with his full brother Benjamin, we see something very different happening in Joseph's heart. Instead of anger, now we see compassion, right? We see warmth filling his heart. And what God is essentially doing now is he's using Benjamin ultimately to soften Joseph's heart. Because in Benjamin, he sees himself. He sees what life could have been like if he had not been betrayed by his brothers. He mourns the years that have been lost. And it's at this point that he sets up this test for his brothers. He isn't at the point of forgiveness quite yet, but he is now moving closer and closer. And the Jewish scholar Meir Steinberg, he comments on this passage, and this is what he writes. He says, "The subsequent test consists in turning back the wheel of time to the original crime against himself, with the circumstances reproduced and the 10 ranged against Benjamin." Joseph essentially sets up Benjamin as a victim of uncontrollable circumstances in order to test if his brothers have changed and how they will react. And this actually reveals one of the steps that help us in the process of healing, which is knowing where to lay appropriate blame. Many times, victims of abuse as well as family trauma will cast blame, oddly enough, on themselves, that perhaps this is something they deserved, that this was something that was that was deserved on their part. And we know, obviously, that Joseph was a spoiled brat, the favorite one in the family, but nothing he did deserved the punishment of being betrayed and sold into slavery. And, it's been said that unless you know how to forgive yourself, right, you cannot forgive others. And that's where Joseph is at this point. I'm sure for years and years, he replayed his family dynamic and wondered to himself, right, was that my fault? Is there something I did that deserved such hatred and betrayal from my family? And in setting this scenario up, he realizes no, right? Because what we see is that Benjamin still is favored, right? Basically what has happened is that Benjamin has become the new favorite in the family, but the brothers have learned how to deal with it. Right? The brothers have learned how to deal with the sinful dynamics of the family. And so Joseph, what he essentially does is he arranges them in birth order, right? From youngest to oldest. The brothers are amazed, right? How could this complete stranger, right, know our birth order? He places Benjamin at the end, gives him 5 times the amount. And what do we read at the end? They're all happy, right? They're all, merry at what's happening. They're happy for Benjamin. And that allows Joseph to recognize what happened was not my fault. And allows him to grieve the loss. And that's the important thing. One of the best classes I took in seminary was an advanced pastoral counseling class. Very small class. Basically, all we did was we took turns being counseled by probably the most gifted professor of counseling that I've encountered. All of us were healed, while we were going through that class. And she unpacked, all of the memories of our lives. And as she would do so, she would remind us, you have to grieve over the appropriate areas of your life, right? You have to grieve your loss. Unless you do that, you cannot heal. And within that small sampling of students, we dealt with memories like fathers walking out on their families, abuse, divorce. We learned that sin and all of its negative consequence is absolutely worth grieving over. We need to learn how to grieve over these things. And in these verses, we see Joseph learning what it means to shed tears of loss, to grieve over the devastating impact of sin. But at the end of this chapter, what we see is Joseph, right, he's still not ready to forgive, right? Even as his brothers have demonstrated a change in his life, in their lives, he's not quite ready to get to the last step. And it's at this critical point in Joseph's life and in the life of his family that we see the healing power of the gospel at work. And at the end of Genesis 44, Judah, we see now, comes to the defense of his younger brother and just kind of setting up the scenario. So after dinner, what happens is Joseph sends them off, and as a final test, he takes an expensive, I think it's a goblet from his home, and he puts it into the sack of Benjamin, as they're heading off. And, as they're, a distance away, he sends his security forces to go search their bags. They find the goblet in Benjamin's bag, and he brings him back and tells him, "Why have you stolen from me? Now, right, I have to keep Benjamin." And picking up the story in Genesis 44, this is what we read. "Now, therefore," this is what Judah says in defense of his brother Benjamin as he's being confronted. "Now, therefore, as soon as I come to your servant, my father," meaning Jacob, "and the boy Benjamin is not with us, then as his life is bound up in the boy's life, as soon as he sees that the boy is not with us, he will die. And your servants will bring down the gray hairs of your servant, our father, with sorrow to Sheol. For your servant became a pledge of safety for the boy to my father, saying, if I do not bring him back to you, then I shall bear the blame before my father all my life. Now therefore, please let your servant remain instead of the boy as a servant to my Lord, and let the boy go back with his brothers. For how can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? I fear to see the evil that would find my father." Then Joseph, the next passage, then Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him. He cried, "Make everyone go from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud, so that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. And it's here that the story of Joseph takes a dramatic turn. We read that out of all of the brothers, it's none other than Judah that offers his own life as a pledge of security for the life of Benjamin. The very same Judah, if you remember, that played the most important role in selling Joseph into slavery, now is able to lay down his life for his other brother, Benjamin. And what Joseph sees in Judah absolutely breaks him. And what is it that he sees in Judah? Well, he sees the gospel at work, right? This is an Old Testament revealing of the gospel. He sees a person transformed by the power of God's love. And remarkably, it's Judah's speech and of self-sacrifice, his love for his father, being a pledge of security that allows this family, right, to move forward. And Mayor Steinberg, he writes exactly that Joseph, basically all of this happens remarkably. It's Judah's moving speech of self-sacrifice, his love for his father and family, that incites Joseph to move the family beyond its pain of the past to a new beginning. And Judah is obviously an imperfect picture of Christ in this story, right? And why is he imperfect? He's racked with sin, right? He is, one brother who hated enough to betray Joseph. Later on, you'll see that his marriage, his personal life is a wreck. But underneath all of this, God is moving, and there are things happening in the family. And by the time this happens, we see that Judah is willing to lay down his own life. He says, I will be the pledge of security for Benjamin. Right? That was the promise I made to Jacob, and I am willing to sacrifice myself for him. please let my brother go. And as Joseph sees this remarkable transformation, as he sees this picture of Christ, right? Because Christ is the pledge of our security, is he not? As he sees this, right, he's completely undone. And finally, he's ready, right? He's ready to forgive, and he's ready to reveal himself to his brother so that this family can have a new beginning. But not only this family, but Joseph as well, that he can restart. And there's usually a common pattern to the healing that we see through this process, and it follows these steps here. And we'll end with this. First, we need to identify an ongoing behavioral, emotional, or mental pattern of sin. Even repressed emotions is a pattern of sin, right? Because we're meant to be fully alive to our emotions, amen? And so Joseph was not living into all that he was created for. And so find that. What is an ongoing behavior, emotion, or mental pattern that is related to a sin in your life, right? And that takes us to our second, which is to seek to discover the root cause of that sin. If it is a defensive reaction against a past event, get in touch with the pain. So not all of our sin is related to a past hurt, but some of them are, right? I would say a lot of them are. And so we need to get past that and recognize where is the root of this. I would guess that some of us, the reason why we cannot get over some of our sinful patterns is you're not getting to the root of it, right? If you ask yourself, why do I get angry at this trigger? It's probably because it's related to something that has hurt you in the past. And so in order to overcome that, you need to get in touch, with the very source of that. Third, express that pain freely, right? Whatever that looks like. Not all of us are weepers, I realize. But I think we're all given a capacity, all right, to feel. And so express that pain freely. And remember that inner healing is release, right? It's a release of your emotions, a release of your wounding, a release of your pain. Fourth, forgive the one who hurts you. Most of inner healing, I would say 90%, maybe even more, 95%, is related to someone that has hurt you. And so forgiveness has to be a part of the equation of healing. And finally, and this is the most important step, ask Jesus to manifest himself in that hurtful event and to heal you, right? In inner healing, it's not the pastor, it's not the counselor who heals you. It's actually Christ. It's Christ who enters into your pain and where you exchange your wounds for his. By his wounds, we are healed. And, as we, read here in the story of Joseph, it can be a long process. Right? It can be years in the making. But it's a journey that I would say is worth starting, right? You have to start it at one point. And I think many of us here in this room, we're ready to begin that journey. And I want to encourage you in that as well. And so I want to leave enough time actually to pray. I'm going to ask Simon, the praise team, to come up. Said a lot, I'm sure, for you to think through and to process. But, can we take a few moments right now? Maybe there's something in this message that has struck a chord with you, and maybe you're thinking through some things, but I'm going to give you at least a little bit of time right here. Begin to allow God to start that healing work in you. So let's pray. I don't know, where you are in this journey of wholeness. It's a lifelong journey. It's something I've come to realize. Um, for me, like Joseph, the journey began, around 30 when our first son Jeremiah was born, and I realized, man, there's a lot of things that I have not dealt with, things that I have not looked into, things I need healing from, and it, brought me, on this long search in the scriptures, as well as different, Christian practices, and I landed on, inner healing, and realized, oh, this is a path that God has given to us, and I discovered the book of Joseph, in my 30s, or the story of Joseph, and it's been incredibly helpful for me. And I pray that it'll give you at least some structure to the healing that God has for you. And, as I shared, it is really that last step, asking Jesus to manifest himself in your hurtful event and to heal you. That is the critical point. And unless you ask Jesus into that pain, right, I don't think you can receive the healing that he wants for you. And during that season, where God was really working on me, there were certain songs that I just listened to over and over and over again that invited Christ, right, into my heart, into my pain, into my wounds. And, for married couples, you guys all have maybe like a song, right, where it strikes up the memories of the love that you shared, with the intimacy. These songs are those for me. When I listen to these songs, it reminds me of the healing work of Christ in my life. But it's a work that's actually indirect, right? Because basically these songs, it reminds me of his love for me, his embrace. And that's what I experienced at that time. When I was in the place of greatest hurt, what I needed was the arms of God around me, embracing me, so I could just rest and weep. So I could just release to him my pain and to say, Lord, I hurt here. This is the pain I've carried for all of these years. And I just need you to hold me. I need to be embraced by that. And it was the most incredible, most beautiful thing that I have ever experienced. Coming from a home that was broken, divorce, a dad who struggled with alcoholism, childhood abuse, that's what I needed. This all-encompassing embrace of my God over me. And so I asked Simon, it's an old song. I don't know if it will strike a chord in the hearts of a new generation, but I want to be blessed, so I asked him to play it. And maybe as I get blessed, you'll get blessed. Right? So, can you just sit in the song if you don't know it? If you know it, let it wash over you. Let the arms of Christ